This PowerPoint takes a look at how psychology evolved from simply philosophical speculations about the mind to a research-based science. First, we'll start by defining psychology. Psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. Throughout the year, starting with today and this first PowerPoint, we are going to be looking at answering the questions about human behavior, how we think, how we feel, and we act. The history of psychology is kind of an interesting one. When you think about it, archaeologists and historians have found evidence that humans have always thought about our behavior and our thought process. So in a way, the study of psychology is really as old as our species. Our first learning target looks at how psychology develops from a pre-scientific root in early understandings of the mind and body to the beginnings of modern science. So that's something we're going to be keeping in mind as we go through this PowerPoint. When you think about explaining human behavior, it really started in the Stone Age. There's a process called trephining where archaeologists found actual skulls that had these holes in them. And what they found in addition to the skulls were drills that were used in aiding this process. So we know that early evidence shows that people believed that abnormal behavior was a result of some kind of demonic possession or some kind of supernatural force that was causing the person to behave in an odd manner. And they thought by using the trephining process, they could actually have an area, a space in the skull for these evil spirits to be released, hopefully curing the person of the abnormal behavior. Some people did unfortunately die in the process or were left, brain damaged in some capacity. So we know this wasn't a successful procedure, but people who did this truly did have their best interests in mind. We're going to start with the pre-scientific explanation. We know that in the 5th and 6th centuries BC, the Greeks began to study human behavior. They decided people's minds weren't dominated by gods or some kind of supernatural force, but by their own minds. A lot of these names are familiar to you. You see on this screen Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. So, these early philosophers attempted to try and explain human behavior. Socrates and Plato believed that the mind was separate from the body. This is a concept you may have heard of, referred to as dualism. They believed that knowledge was innate, that we were born with this capacity for knowledge and our personality was inborn. Aristotle, on the other hand, did not buy into dualism. He believed the soul was not separate from the body and that knowledge was not pre-existing. He believed that it grew from experiences. So when you look at kind of the nature-nurture debate, Socrates and Plato believed in nature, that it was inborn. Aristotle believed that he supported the nurture side, that it was more environmental. And we'll look at how their basic beliefs blossomed into further theories that will be explained later on. Other people contributed. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, the nature-nurture debate was officially introduced. René Descartes, who is considered the father of modern philosophy, he believed abnormal behavior was caused by abnormalities in the brain instead of supernatural causes. He believed that the mind and body were distinct and were separable. So René Descartes supported Socrates and Plato's suggestion of dualism. René Descartes had kind of an interesting curiosity about anatomy. He was one of the first persons to dissect animals and use animals to understand human behavior, which is something we still presently practice. Scientists do. He had an interesting conclusion that was drawn. He believed that the fluid in the brain cavities contained these animal spirits and that these animal spirits flowed from the brain which we now call nerves, and further moved into the rest of the body. He was right that nerve paths were important and they enabled reflexes in other parts of our body to communicate, but he was inaccurate in a lot of ways. Nonetheless, a lot of his work formed the foundation of what we currently believe and practice today. Another name you might be familiar with is Francis Bacon. He introduced the scientific method, which implies drawing knowledge from the natural world through experimentation, observation, and testing a hypothesis. The scientific method is something that psychologists largely base their current practices on, deriving empirical evidence, which kind of leads us into John Locke. John Locke adapted the theory of tabula rasa. He believed human beings were born as blank slates. He further established that we need to understand behavior by using empiricism. And empiricism is one of your vocab words. It's the view that knowledge originates in experience and that science should therefore rely on observation and experimentation. So the idea of, forming a hypothesis that is testable, that is measurable, that can be backed, and then formation of theory. Another interesting explanation that arrived around the late 1700s was a concept known as phrenology. It was introduced, here comes the bell. Excuse the interruption.
Good morning again. This is the FAT PPS Building Committee. We really appreciate if you could come upstairs right now to fill out your contract for the coming year. Again, you are located in the third floor TPC on the east side of the building. Again, please come on up to sign your contract.
You can just ignore that. I'm not going to start over. We're going to probably have more interruptions, so bear with me. Franz Gall introduced the concept of phrenology, and he had an interesting idea that the bumps on our skull, which we all know we possess, we have these ridges and flat spots and whatnot. He believed that they actually revealed parts of a person's personality. And so he actually mapped out the brain, and he believed the brain had particular feelings and behaviors that resided in certain locations. So when we look at this next slide, you can see that this was Franz Gall's attempt to map out different regions of our brain that conveyed certain things about our personality. Once again, incorrect, but another example of how we've been attempting to explain behavior. And this one was a more biological approach. Our second learning target is looking at a more modern approach to psychology and how that approach transitioned from what the early philosophers attempted to explain. One important person in particular was a guy by the name of Wilhelm Wundt. In the late 1800s, he started to think about the mind's structure. He actually opened the very first laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. So one thing you will need to know and recognize Wilhelm Wundt for is his first psychological experiment that was conducted. And it was more of a sensation and perception experiment where he tested the delay or reaction time from a person seeing a particular object like a ball bounce and their response to it. His student, Edward Bradford Titchener, actually introduced a philosophy, an early school of psychology known as structuralism. He brought psychology to the United States, and he opened up the first United States psychology laboratory at Cornell. Structuralism was supported by Wundt, but introduced by Titchener, was the very first school of psychology. And it used a technique called introspection. And like the prefix intro, it's an idea that we look inward to find answers about our behavior. It's very self-reflective. So when you're looking at attempting to explain human behavior, Titchener and Wundt supported the idea of looking inward. And some of us are very insightful in that process. When we think about our actions and our behavior, we are oftentimes very insightful and knowledgeable about why we do the things we do. And the experiment that they used to really draw upon subjects that came in and volunteered to participate in experiments where introspection was used, somewhat cheesy. They had them look at a rose, and they encouraged them to reflect on how the rose smelled, how it felt, the different sensations that they experienced, and to be able to internalize them and explain them. William James was also a contributor. He actually came up with another early school of psychology known as functionalism. He was one of the first U.S. psychologists. He developed functionalism kind of in a reaction to structuralism. He really didn't like the method of introspection. He was very much a follower of Darwin, and he took a more evolutionary approach to looking at the mind, and he believed that mental and behavioral processes were functional, and they looked at how they enabled the organism to adapt and survive. You can see the evolutionary approach intertwined to his philosophy and flourish. He also is well known for writing the very first psychology textbook, Principles of Psychology, and he did that over a 12-year time span. So it took him quite a while. It wasn't something that just developed overnight. He did this while practicing, and he was a professor, and his students were all male at the time. He was a Harvard professor, and the next slide introduces you to a woman by the name of Mary Calkins. She's a student of James. Only after all of the other male students left, because there was a sister school outside of Harvard that all women at the time were supposed to attend. When Mary Calkins asked William James if she could sit in one of his classes, the rest of his male students withdrew. So he taught Mary Calkins one-on-one, and she became a famous memory researcher, and she was well known for being the first female American Psychological Association president. Unfortunately, Harvard denied her the diploma. They said she could get a psychology degree from the sister school that the women attended. So that was unfortunate. After her death, they recognized that she should have, in fact, been awarded a degree and a diploma from Harvard. Another female in the field of psychology is a woman by the name of Margaret Floy Washburn. And she was the very first woman to receive a PhD in psychology. And that's a name that you will have to familiarize yourself with as well. So this just gave you a real quick overview at kind of how the field of psychology, which is relatively new, developed, and how the philosophers made contributions, and then Lund and Titchener and James kind of brought their own perspective to the actual field of psychology. But our next real focus is going to be looking at the contemporary and modern approaches that are practiced and used today.